Hello again, welcome to another episode of Northern Spotlights with me, Terry McStay. So my guest today is Andy Aldrin, and we'll be hearing from him about what it was like growing up as the son of the second man to walk on the moon, his own career in the space industry, the changing nature of the space industry from the 70s through to how it is now, and then also his current work in education, encouraging young people to explore some of the new opportunities in space. So Andy, it's great to see you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Terry. So I'm Andy Aldrin. I'm a professor at Embry-Riddle University. I run two graduate space studies programs. I'm also president of the Aldrin Family Foundation.
So, as you can tell from Andy's accent, he's not from the north of England, as most of our guests are, but he is from the north in a global sense because you're from the US. So we've made a bit of an exception inviting Andy here today. The other reason is that you might recognise his surname, and there aren't that many people who can say one of their family members has walked on another planet. I mean, I know the moon isn't, strictly speaking, another planet, because you are, of course, the son of Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon.
Yep.
One of only 12 who walked on the moon.
That's correct, yeah.
Well, I'm going to start with this. I love this photo. So every kid in the 60s and 70s had a pretend astronaut helmet. But there you are with what I'm assuming is a real astronaut's helmet.
It is. You know, so I'm a space cadet, and I've been around space my entire life. And most of my friends that are in the business have done it by choice. I was drafted, and this is kind of like literally my draft day.
Really?
When it was about this time. So I'm I think 7 or 8 in this picture, and my dad is actually at this point, I think he's training for the Gemini 12 mission.
Right.
And the Gemini 12 mission was interesting because we had been doing spacewalks for a long time, but not a long time, but several years, and had kind of failed miserably. We had really struggled with how an astronaut could do things in space. And one of the really interesting things about my dad has more to do with the things he's invented and the technologies he's helped push along, not just actually walking on the moon. So one of the things that he did with Gemini 12 was actually he came up with ways of fixing your feet and using tools and things. And his spacewalk for Gemini 12 was clearly the most successful spacewalk up to this point in time. He actually did things not literally fixing the spacecraft, but as if he was fixing the spacecraft. It's a long story, but basically at that time, my father was always a scuba diver.
Okay.
And he recruited me to be his dive buddy. And it was just at the same time that he was using scuba as a way of training for spacewalks.
Okay.
And so in some ways, I got kind of recruited in. I joke about it. So I was sort of his spacewalk dive buddy. Not really, but so this was at about the same time. But it really is kind of, for me, when I got brought into space. And from that point on, for almost 60 years, we had a conversation about space. And you know, actually, anyone who knows my dad knows it's really not a conversation. It's a monologue. But what that did for me is it meant that, you know, every night when Dad was home at the dinner table, we're talking about space. He always talked about space, and the way my father kind of understands things is by talking it through.
Right.
You know, some people write it down, and he talks about it. And so I listened, you know, from the time I was 8 years old and till whatever, you know, I'm well into my 60s now. And it's kind of been not just listening to him, but incredibly interesting people would come and talk to him. And so it was kind of, in many ways, a great education outside my more formal education about space. And I didn't necessarily, when I was young, I agreed with everything because I didn't know better. But as I grew older, I kind of, there were times when I'd go, you know, Dad, I'm not sure that really makes sense. But it was a relationship.
Yeah. It's interesting though, you're talking about the different things he did, and in terms of contributing to, you know, the whole space program. Because I suppose most people think, when they think of Buzz Aldrin or Neil Armstrong or other people who walked on the moon, they think of the thing they did as being something that only lasted a few days.
Right.
But of course, they had a whole career in that world, and probably did, hundreds of other things that are almost as important, but that never really gets heard about.
My dad was a little bit unique in that most of the astronauts retired and went on to do other things in business and things like that. But my dad never stopped thinking about space and coming up with the next big mission. I mean, it wasn't more than certainly less than a year after he walked on the moon that he was starting to think about, actually it was literally months, that he started thinking about the space shuttle and all of these kinds of things.
Really?
And I remember he'd come home and he'd go, well, this is the way they want to do it. This is the way I want to do it. And so, yeah, he never gave that up. And, until, even now he thinks about that stuff. I think he's 94 now, so he's a little less active in doing that for maybe the last 5 years or so. But he's always pursued space exploration as a passion with creativity. And he's done it all his life, which is a little unique among the astronauts.
And talking of unique, it must have been quite special for you. I can't imagine how special it was for you in 1969.
Actually, you were
watching.
It wasn't.
No.
Because one of the things you have to understand is where we lived, there were astronauts all over the place. And so we lived at the end of a street, so we had kind of a pie-shaped lot. And there were 5 houses behind us. 3 of them were astronauts. The house directly behind us was Alan Bean, who flew on Apollo 12. So, yeah, astronauts were everywhere. So it actually wasn't that big a deal.
Right. But you must have sat watching TV along with half of the world on that day and watching. That must be, I can't imagine how strange that must have been, watching your dad.
No, remember, I'm an 11-year-old kid. and I admire my dad and all of that kind of stuff. But like any 11-year-old, I'm convinced that my dad's primary function in life is to embarrass me. Right.
Okay.
So he's, and before he went to the moon, he had talked about, how do you walk on the moon? He said, well, I'm figuring this out. You don't really walk and you can't run. You kind of hop. And I knew when he got there that he was going to experiment with mobility on the moon. So he's hopping around. And there's this cable running from the lunar module out to an experiment out there. And I'm looking at this cable and I'm looking at my dad hopping. And I know he's going to trip over this cable, fall flat on his face in front of 300 million people, but most importantly, in front of my 25 classmates. And I'm just wondering, how am I going to live this down? I'm just thinking, maybe it's a long summer. Maybe they'll forget. And so honestly, that's what I'm thinking as an 11-year-old, because we all live in our local environment.
Just the same as every other 11-year-old, you're worried about your dad embarrassing you.
No.
At work.
Ask any 11-year-old. I think they have the same concern. Some of them won't admit it publicly.
Right.
But it's just a normal thing. It was normal to be an astronaut's kid.
Yeah. So was it inevitable that was the world that you were going to go into, or the career that you were going to
Not
have?
at all. No, and certainly other than just talking about it and knowing about it. No, I actually, I began my professional career as a Sovietologist. I had sort of, as a result of kind of teachers and professors, I sort of angled off into what fascinated me. My passion it started out being international relations, comparative politics. And then I realized the Soviet Union was this mysterious place, and it was fascinating to me. Okay. And they had a space program, and they beat the United States into space. And so I got captivated by that. So I was a Sovietologist. Right. And, I wrote my dissertation on how the Soviet Union beat the United States into space, which is a fascinating story of entrepreneurship. It had happened from the bottom up, which is not what you'd expect to see in the Soviet Union. And so there's sort of a generalized theory of innovation that comes out of that if you're going to have really big innovation, it won't come from the top down. It's got to come from the bottom up. Right. And so I was well on the way to my career as a Sovietologist. I was working at the Rand Corporation. I had an office looking down the Santa Monica Pier and just buzzing back and forth between the Soviet Union and California. What could possibly go wrong, right? And then the Soviet Union falls apart, which was really impolite of them, I thought.
Well, it's very inconsiderate. Yeah.
Right. And so yeah, so my research agenda went, and at the time I kind of
so
got,
it did literally just ended once that.
no, I mean, I could sort of continue on, I suppose, but the need for fresh and up and coming Sovietologists, fresh out PhDs, wasn't that great. And I connected with a few aerospace companies that were, of course, at the time, everyone was trying to go to Russia and get engines or do something with the Russians. And so I knew a lot about what they were doing because that had become kind of my research agenda.
Right.
And so I got pulled into aerospace industry. It really wasn't my intention, but it looked like an interesting place to work, and they paid a lot more money than research. So I found myself in industry, and here I was, a recovering Sovietologist, and I started doing some work for Rocketdyne, worked for TRW for a while, and then got brought into Boeing, where I stayed for several years. And actually, I became executive director of strategy, business development, and advanced programs for their NASA business unit, and then for their launch business. Again, recovering Sovietologist, PhD in political science, and I'm running, literally hundreds of engineers doing advanced programs and things like that. It was interesting for that. It was kind of an interesting career development. And people say, well, how did you develop your career? I go, just don't try this at home. Right?
It's not the typical route to be a rocket scientist.
It isn't. But, the lesson was that I had a passion for international politics, for the Soviet Union, for space always. And so I kind of followed my passion rather than a plan. Yeah. And in many ways, you should follow I think my advice to students is follow your passion and your energy, as long as it's sort of in the direction you want to move in. That, sometimes it's like sailing upwind. You tack one way or the other, as long as you keep going towards the destination.
Because I think that's something you can't learn, is it? You can learn, presumably you can learn some elements of rocket science, but if that passion isn't there, then it just isn't there, is it? And I think there's
I think the passion is there in most students. What you have to unlearn in some ways is the rigid adherence to a pathway. Yeah. And to be sure, it's easier in America than most other countries that you can actually do things and sort of move careers around. I think more so than other places.
Yeah, I can't imagine there are many corporations in the UK or in Europe where they would put someone with no formal training in rocket science, if you like, to head up a rocket science division. I mean, that's quite a brave move on their part.
And I owe this to a good friend and still a good friend who hired me in, and Brent Sherwood, who hired me because he just said, I thought you thought differently and that you thought more strategically. And Brett and I remain friends to this day. In fact, he hired me into Boeing, and probably within 3 years I was his boss, which is an interesting thing. But Brett went on to go to JPL, and most recently he was a senior vice president at Blue Origin for advanced programs. And so everything you see at Blue Origin, all of the moon programs and things like that, were developed by Brett, and we remain to this day, I think, great friends. And so, building and hanging on to those relationships is an important thing. And I give him credit, for thinking differently.
And so once you'd kind of entered that world of space and rockets and all that kind of stuff, did you feel that, this is what I want to do, this is where I belong, sort of thing?
Yes and yes and no. So in terms of space, absolutely. Absolutely, I thought I was fascinated by it. It seemed like a wonderful environment to be in, a wonderful forest to walk through, if you will. There's just so many interesting things. And the corporate environment, I probably was less of an attraction. I tended to do really well when I had bosses that I liked and worked really well with, and I didn't do so well with others.
I think we can all...
So I think that, I have zero desire to go back to that right now. I think I also, there were kind of three things that I thought about as a career, kind of an endpoint. And one was running a research institute or educational program, a graduate level program or something. Another was running a company. Mm-hmm. And then, a startup. I wasn't sure exactly what that looked like because this is sort of before the startup mania. And then the third was actually being a senior corporate executive. Mm. So tried the senior corporate executive thing, and it really wasn't for me. Ran a company, Moon Express, for a while, a short while. It's a Silicon Valley startup. We were going to the moon, not surprisingly. And I found out I was pretty good at doing that. But it was hard work and really, really super stressful. Mm. So kind of checked that box. Right. And then actually I kind of retired and ended up in education. And so I was at Florida Tech for a while, and now I'm at Embry-Riddle. And I really do have a passion for education. I like doing it at the graduate level because it's pretty sophisticated stuff. Yeah. And in order to do it, I have to learn a lot. So that right now, that's really my passion. Okay. And I absolutely love what I'm doing. And so happy to work with, I'm here in the North talking to several universities, and I'm just looking for research projects, things that we can do together with my current employer, Embry-Riddle University. Right. And so, I want to just pursue interesting stuff in space, help other people, other universities, people outside the U.S. understand what space is really all about. I mean, what I do is kind of try to make sense of it. And in some ways, making sense means pointing out the nonsense. Because like any other industry, and maybe more so because there's so much hype about space right now. It's kind of saying, you got to stop and think, does this stuff make sense? And that's kind of what I do.
Because I get the sense that the industry now is very different to what it was when you were, say, in Boeing. Yeah. I mean, how was it then when you were in Boeing running that kind of department?
Well, so the way the industry worked 10 years ago was the government would kind of start thinking about programs, and you would go and talk to them and try to shape them to do the kind of program that your company wanted to do or was good at doing. And then, there would be a period of time where you're sort of working and trying to, as we said, shape requirements.
So it was very much a conversation rather than just, this is what we want, can you build
We'll
it?
get to that part.
Oh, right, okay.
We'll get to that. And then at some point the government says, okay, this is what we want. And so they issue a request for proposals, and then it's all very specific, and this is what you're going to build. And then you propose something which is a very detailed proposal, hundreds, sometimes thousands of pages of how you're going to build what the government wants. And to do that, mostly you need to have really good engineers and program managers that could do that kind of stuff. And today it's completely different. It is becoming completely different, where the government is saying, these are the kinds of things we want. We want somebody to land astronauts on the moon. How you do it is kind of up to you. Okay. And by the way, we want you to find somebody else to pay for part of it. Right. We want you to find other customers who are going to go to the moon. And that's just an example. We're doing the same thing for low Earth orbit. Sure. We do the same thing for communications. We're actually doing the same thing for remote sensing. And so it requires a very different sort of mindset. You've got to understand, for example, the entire telecommunications industry and where your company can fit in that industry, and then where the government fits there, because it may be that the commercial marketplace is going to be the majority of your market, and the government may only be a small part of it. And so that's a completely different mindset than the future from within a company. The other thing that's completely different, and I think this is actually the real revolution in space, is that, well, my dad went to the moon. 3 people went to the moon. 2 people landed on the moon. And everybody else watched. there are, let's say, 100,000 people that were working on the program, but 300 million people were watching, like watching my dad on the moon when he was going to trip and fall on the moon. But today, it's not observational as it was. It's going to be participatory.
Okay.
And so with the foundation, we're actually we're sponsoring kids building satellites in high school.
Right. Actual satellites, not pretend ones, but
not
real
pretend
ones.
ones, satellites that can fly. And that's an incredible thing. And so kids that are in school today can look forward to the opportunity to participate in building something as they grow up. I think they will have the opportunity to fly in space. Now, it's never going to be cheap, but it will be, I think the price point will come down to where someone who's sort of reasonably middle class can afford to take a vacation and take a trip. As for the recreation, it might be either take the family on a grand vacation or go into space. And that'll be a decision that the head of the family will make. And but it will be a choice for kids that are in school today. They will have the choice of flying in space. I think most of them. Right. And I think if you go a bit further into the future, and maybe kids that are just getting into primary school, I really believe they'll have the opportunity to work on the moon.
Right.
Not as astronauts, but as electricians, as plumbers. You're going to need a lot of plumbing on the moon. As technicians, because I think there's a reasonably good potential for a lunar-based space economy, and so that we're going to need people like that.
And this is potentially in the next 20 or 30 years.
30 sounds better to me. Okay. Just to be honest.
So that sounds great, but why? So why would we have a base on the moon? Oh, that might be a simple question, but...
Oh, no, it's not. It's the most important question. Why? I mean, and as I get back to education, this is fundamentally what I try and teach. You can't teach them the why. You have to teach them how to ask why and how to find out for themselves. The why of a lunar-based economy must be somebody's going to buy something from the moon, right? It has to be that. And so...
Well, there's a lot of cheese up there, apparently, so that could be...
That's actually not far from the potential truth. I mean, the cheese is rocket fuel. And so there are regions in the moon at the bottom of craters that mostly sit on the poles where there's permanent shade, which are the coldest places in the solar system, literally. I mean, they're 20 degrees above Kelvin. And so there's ice in the bottom of these things. We think. Well, actually, we're pretty sure there's ice. We don't know what it looks like, whether it's mostly rocks and stone, a little bit of ice, but there's ice. And ice is hydrogen and oxygen. And hydrogen and oxygen are rocket fuel. And that's actually the most efficient chemical propellant. And right now, chemical propellant makes a lot of sense. And we talk about a lot of other stuff. So one of the potential whys is that it is significantly cheaper to get something off of the moon into space than it is to get something off of the Earth. And so where you can take something from the moon and deliver it to someplace in space, and it's cheaper to get there than it is to deliver it from the Earth, you have a price advantage.
Right.
And so if that, and this is not guaranteed, and I've actually done some, I call it stupid math, but the important thing is ask the right question and do as little as you need to do mathematically to kind of figure out what matters. Yeah. And so, it sort of comes out that it costs about $1,500-ish. Let's say it's $1,500, $2,000 a kilogram to take a kilogram of something, anything from the moon and bring it to low Earth orbit. And so that's actually kind of tight because actually it's maybe $5,000 a kilogram right now. So that's not a lot of overlap. So I'm not sure that's going to make sense. But as you go further out to geosynchronous, it makes a lot of sense to bring things from the moon. So the question is really, will there be stuff from the moon that you can use in space that's cheaper? And if the answer to that is yes, there will be a lunar-based economy. Okay.
So that's kind of launching things from the moon because it's easier, cheaper. more efficient to do that.
And there's a lot of stuff on the moon besides water, rocket fuel. There are a lot of different metals. And so the moon is just sort of a catcher's mitt for asteroids. And so there's all kinds of stuff there in bits here and there, but those bits could be, let's just say 200 tons of platinum in some location. And so that stuff may make sense to find it, to process it on the moon and send it out for use in geosynchronous orbit or somewhere else. It may make sense. And so I think there's a reasonable case to be made for the moon becoming the source of resources for developing a space economy over the next, let's say, century or so. Okay. I mean, I think that's it's a reasonable possibility. It's what we should really be doing on the moon right now.
Okay. So if we could go back to your possibly less interesting corporate days at Boeing. So you did that for a few years.
Right, about 15, I think.
15, okay. And so at some point you decided, I want to do something different, or did events conspire?
No, not at all. I think over time I just realized that I really wasn't all that happy doing that.
Okay.
I mean, as an executive, you got paid a lot of money, and that was all good. But no, I had been kind of looking for something to grab me, and so someone came and said, I've got this company. We're going to build a spacecraft to go to the moon. Do you want to come and run the company? And I thought, sure, why not? Right. It honestly sounded like a great experience. To be honest with you, I knew the business wasn't really all that solid, but we were competing for the X Prize, and actually we won 3 interim X Prizes.
Right. So that was something that NASA launched in order to attract new.
No. This was a purely private venture.
Okay.
Purely private. We had some cooperation with NASA technologically. They supported us in developing engines and things like this. Whenever we needed expertise, we could go to NASA, but this thing was absolutely 100% financed by private sources. And the idea was, one, to win the X Prize and go to the moon. And at that point, we believed that NASA would be following shortly after that to start developing lunar programs, and we would be in a primary position.
Right. But it didn't quite.
No, actually, NASA decided they're going to Mars. Which again,
we've done the moon. Let's go a bit further.
No, well, we did. Yeah, and actually, my father was famous for been there, done that. Obama added to that, even saying, got that T-shirt. But it was sort of a little bit like the Soviet Union disappearing on me, that we'd done this and we thought that this was going to be the next logical step, and that NASA kind of pivoted to going to Mars. And of course now, until recently, it was clear they had pivoted to going back to the moon. Who knows what's going to happen in the future, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if we pivoted back to going to Mars, which would that'd just be an interesting development. Anyway, so...
Because I guess in the 60s and 70s, it was NASA who was driving all of this, but obviously more recently, it's opened up much more widely.
It's still, with respect to human spaceflight and space science, Earth observation, NASA is still the driver. But the thing you can't forget is that national security is by far the largest customer. I mean, NASA gets a budget of let's say 25, may get up to $30 billion. But if you look at the national security intelligence budgets, much of which are classified, I think it's probably double that.
Okay.
And so the real money, and in many ways a much more stable money, will always be in national security. You can't forget that NASA is, in a sense, it's science, and science is great to do, but at the end of the day, that the nation does not depend upon it. The nation depends upon national security programs in space.
I mean, you mentioned that you start out as a Sovietologist. I mean, do you still? I mean, because I mean, at one point, the Russian space program and the American space program were pretty much neck and neck, but that's probably not the case now. I mean, what is going on in the Russian space program?
So actually, let me just say, first of all, I don't follow it closely. No. Probably the last time that I was, well, for sure, the last time I was in the Soviet Union was 2005, Russia, excuse me. I think what's remarkable about the Russian space program is how long it managed to survive on momentum. And a lot of it was kind of baked into the system, that you had a very differently structured system so that they would have institutes, manufacturing facilities that were funded on the basis of the number of people that worked there. And the whole social system was also part of it. So you had factories that had education, housing, food, and groceries were all provided by the state as part of their budget. And so that declined and people were having a tough time. And projects weren't necessarily getting approved, but they continued to sort of roll along.
Okay.
That's kind of catching up with them. And I think one of the big problems is people in Russia don't seem to be as excited about space as they used to be. Certainly, they have real funding issues. It's kind of interesting. You can look at the Russian space budget and track it against oil prices, and right. it goes up as the price of oil goes up. It goes down as the price of oil goes down. So I think people aren't coming into the program, and so it's kind of fading. And then, of course, China is sort of growing, and that'll be a really interesting phenomenon to see what happens. And I don't know what China is doing.
No, I don't think anyone knows, do we? Apart from the Chinese.
Apart from China, right? I think, yeah.
So that project you were involved in with the SpaceX Prize, where did that?
Oh, okay. So, well, I mean, we won. What happened with the X Prizes? It started. I forget. It was a long time ago, and it was kind of chugging along, but no one was really making progress. And I think the X Prize Foundation said we need to do something to kind of kickstart this. So they created some interim prizes, and we won 3 of those prizes, which was cool. I mean, it's a nice thing to do. I left the company shortly after that. After that, the program kind of faded away. It was largely sponsored by one of the founders of Google. I forget which one it was. Okay. And so I think they just kind of said, look, if you guys aren't going to get there, they extended the deadline for landing on the moon several times. And they just said, we're done with that. But by that point, I had already kind of had a falling out with the Silicon Valley founders, which is kind of standard operating procedure in Silicon Valley.
Okay. I mean, because to me it sounds very. I mean, do you think the way the industry is working now, in that there are lots of individual companies doing their own thing and coming up with ideas and kind of suggesting solutions to things, as opposed to the way it was in, say, the 70s, where it was very much driven by NASA.
Right.
Do you think that is a more efficient, productive way of doing things? Because it sounds slightly chaotic at times.
It is. And so I'm just, actually, I've never had the question put to me quite that way, but I honestly think, so there's inefficiency and chaos. And let's just say there's 1,000 firms out there, probably 800 of them aren't going to survive. And so that is, in essence, a lot of capital destruction, waste. But the sort of traditional economy didn't have companies going out of business, but there's certainly a lot of waste built into the traditional way of doing business. Does it balance out in the end? I don't know. I mean, that would be a really good question. I mean, you could probably, it's a great research question. You could probably sort of sort it out and kind of figure out. Calculating the waste on the government side is easy, and a lot of people have done that. Calculating the inefficiencies on the commercial side would be kind of a stretch. My guess is it's probably a little bit of a balance. But I mean, kind of what's going on right now is we have a whole bunch of small companies and we have 2 big companies, right? I mean, it's really, and there are a couple of others that will grow. Probably none of them will grow to be as big as SpaceX and Blue Origin. And Blue Origin, of course, is self-funded. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. They are largely self-funded. They're moving more and more to NASA funding. And then you've got a bunch of other smaller companies, and some of which, like, for example, Rocket Labs, will probably do, it seems to be doing really well. So there's some other, and I'm tracking all these companies, and some of them will do well. A lot of them won't. We're already starting to see a lot of companies go bankrupt. I think one example, which is, I think, particularly significant, was Virgin Orbit, which of course was a Branson company. And I think there were a lot of things about what they were doing that I thought were really good. They were looking to the U.S. government, particularly national security community, as their market. I think the problem was they anticipated launching 20 or 30 times a year, and the market was like 5 launches a year. And that's not going to sustain you. The really interesting thing, though, is we did this at Boeing and Lockheed back in at the turn of the century, where we built launch vehicles anticipating 40 launches a year. And we ended up only launching 4 times a year. And this is literally billions of dollars of investment in a 4 launch a year program, and you're not making money at that. And so I think conversations were very serious about getting out of that business. And the Department of Defense said, look, let's figure out how we can reorganize these contracts. We're not going to make you we're not going to make you whole from all the money you've lost, but let's at least keep you going in the business. So we've done this before to sort of massively overestimate what the market really was. And that is a big problem.
Right. So they were gearing up for 40 launches a year, and actually nobody wanted to launch things into space 40 times a year.
The irony was a lot of that was driven by a belief that communications constellations were going to drive the launch industry. And so there was an interesting company, among others, called Teledesic that was owned by Bill Gates and Craig McCaw. And so, rock star investors, they were going to launch 890 satellites, I think, which at the time seemed utterly fantastic. They're going to darken the sky with satellites. And in the end, the Gates and McCaw pulled out. The whole thing just sort of crumbled. And with it, most of the launches that we were building up for.
Right.
And so there are parallels, kind of concerning parallels with what's going on today.
Right. And I guess that's the nature of innovation and enterprise, particularly in environments such as space, that nobody really knows the answers, but everyone's trying to find them, and some of them will be the right path to go down, and some of them won't, and that's just the nature of it, I guess, isn't it?
And you're right that, the essence of entrepreneurship is risk, and taking irrational risks, and then there are people like me going, that's not rational. And then entrepreneurs going, wait, you'll see. And someone will figure a lot of these things out and make a lot of money. And certainly Elon Musk is making a lot of money. SpaceX is, I think, now becoming profitable. There's real questions that I have about sort of the long-term future and how all this works out. But yeah, they will figure it out in spite of the fact that sort of realists who kind of look at the bottom line say, no, that can't possibly work. Someone will figure out certain things. But along the way, you're going to have an awful lot of people that won't figure it out. And we're seeing that now.
Yeah. Because, we're speaking now not that long since we watched the first of those rockets coming back down to Earth and landing on the launch pad, which, I'm not no expert, but that just looked impossible.
It
and
did.
Probably was thought of it impossible not too long ago.
So sitting in the launch industry at the time, no, we didn't think of it as impossible technically. We just thought of it as being insanely expensive to do.
Right.
And so we chose not to do that. And I was there at this first Falcon Heavy launch, and to see those 2 boosters landing.
That was incredible.
It was. It was really moving to me, and it kind of, it shocked me, and I go, my God, this is real. Yeah. The really interesting thing about it, though, is that actually my dad was with me. And so before the launch, we got to go look at the launch vehicle as it was being assembled.
Okay.
It was like a month or two before the launch. And the two, there's a big central booster and there's two outboard boosters that are basically Falcon 9s. The Falcon 9s had flown before. And when we thought about it in traditional space and thought about reusability, we thought that you'd really have to disassemble the entire engine, look at everything, and then put it back together, test it, do all that kind of stuff. They literally didn't clean the carbon off of it.
Before it went up again.
Yes. And so the innovation, I mean, to be sure, there are a lot of things that SpaceX did, and the propulsion lead is a brilliant guy, Tom Mueller, and but the fundamental innovation wasn't technical; it was managerial, and it was SpaceX, and I'll say probably Elon, saying, "No, let's just fly this thing again. Let's just see what happens."
Yeah.
And that was an incredible risk, but it paid off.
Yeah.
And I think,
and probably a risk that a big organization like NASA would never have taken.
Oh God, no.
Yeah.
No, because the cost of failure for NASA, not just in monetary terms, in political terms, is so high. The cost of failure for Boeing is much higher. And so, no, I think a publicly held company would struggle to make that decision, because if it didn't work out, the shareholders, in the case of NASA, the public, would go absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
And in the case of SpaceX, they've done an interesting thing with it. They sort of twisted the failure is not an option phrase that NASA used to operate by. Failure is not only an option, it's advertising for SpaceX.
Yeah.
And so that's an incredible thing.
I'd imagine if it hadn't worked, they would have made as much kind of capital out of it in terms of their publicity and their reputation.
Well, look at the first Starship launch. That vehicle failed in so many different ways and failed spectacularly and catastrophically. I mean, the launch pad got destroyed, and it was obviously something that they knew was a huge risk. And for any normal company, it would have been just devastating. Certainly a publicly held company, you'd fire the CEO, the chief engineer, and everyone else. And you looked at the pictures at the time, and when the thing blew up, everyone was cheering. It was crazy. But, this is radically different. And this part of SpaceX is, it's truly interesting. And I have to say, in a lot of ways, it's admirable. I still, Starship is so big, and it's a weird sort of vehicle. I don't know if it really makes sense, but I have to say it's fun watching.
Some things don't need to make sense, do they? They just,
Well, but
But as you say, I mean, in terms of what innovation is all about, it is about being prepared to fail and maybe not celebrating it, but at least accepting that it is going to happen and not being devastated by it, but learning from it and moving on.
Well, I mean, the innovation theorists would say, well, not exactly. You kind of want to plan for this kind of stuff. Sort of just going out and launching it when you know it's going to fail might not be the greatest plan. But I mean, there's an element of just clearly you have to innovate, you have to push a little bit on the risk. And it kind of depends on the level of innovation. If I go back to my dissertation, I mean, one of the interesting parts of it was this was the first space program that was ever really created as a standalone space program. And as I said, it was a process of entrepreneurship. And the guy that was driving it, Sergei Korolev, took incredible personal risk more than anything, because this was the Soviet Union and he started this program under Stalin. And at the time he was doing this, all kinds of people were being thrown in jail. Korolev himself got sent to the Gulag in the 30s for sabotage. And so there was a lot of risk in what he was doing, because what he was doing was actually building a rocket and selling it as a ballistic missile. And it was a lousy ballistic missile, but it was a great rocket, because to this day, Russia is flying the same first stage, basically. I mean, they've done some tweaks, but the rocket that they launched in 1957, the first stage of that, is fundamentally the same as what launches Russian and American astronauts to the space station today.
Really?
But that, you want to talk about risk.
Yeah. It's incredible. Now, since I have someone who might know the answer to this, I'm going to ask this question, whether this thing's true, because there's this story about how NASA, in order for astronauts to be able to write things when they're in space, NASA invested millions in a pen that didn't rely on gravity to force the ink to the point, whereas the Russians just took a pencil. Is there any truth in that story? Because it's a great story, but I don't know if it's...
It is. I got in a lot of trouble for this too. Someone from Fisher Pen came in. What are you talking about? It was specifically over the question, did my dad use a Fisher pen? So I don't honestly know the answer, but I think Fisher Pen came up with the idea, and it's been great marketing.
Right.
So no, probably not.
No.
I mean, I don't say remember, but so the Omega watch that they wore, you would think that, well, this is NASA, of course. They designed a watch and had Omega build it for them or something like that. No, I mean, they basically had their spec for the watch, and they went around to local shops in Texas buying up watches and testing them. And the Omega Speedmaster was the only watch that met their specs.
Right.
And so that's what they flew. It wasn't, kind of,
Wasn't
at the
complicated
time,
than that?
they didn't have time to design a pen.
Yeah, they had many, many other things to design, I'm sure.
But I will tell you a pen story that's interesting.
Please.
So they had sort of prescribed pens to take up there. And there's an incident that was not widely publicized. It's kind of come out recently. That didn't involve their pen. So when they landed on the moon, they actually... I think they did their spacewalk, and then they got back and went to sleep briefly, which they probably, they didn't sleep all that well.
How could you sleep when you're in the middle of that?
And so my dad says that he went to sleep, and before he went to sleep, he saw there's like a piece of plastic on the floor. He wondered what that was, and then tried to go to sleep. And then when he got up, he I think before he did check with it, and he looked around. And he found out that it was the cover, the sort of actuator for the ascent engine arm button.
Which sounds important.
Well, it is. If you can't if you can't arm the ascent engine, you can't fly. You can't fire the ascent engine. You're stuck on the moon for eternity, which in their case wouldn't have been very long. No. And so he looked at this and he goes, so he said one of his true regrets in life is he didn't say, Houston, we have a problem. But he did call Houston, and they said, okay, yeah, we'll look at it, Buzz, and we'll figure this out. So they tried to sleep for a while, got up, said, you guys figured this problem. No, Buzz, we don't have something yet. I don't know. I stick your finger in it or something. He goes, well, you can't really do that. And they had... They did have, I think there are Fisher pens because there are metal pens that they flew. And he said, you can't do that because it'll short out. Right. Can't stick your finger. And they didn't have pencils, but my dad had brought an unauthorized felt tip pen with him because he liked felt tip pens. Okay. And it wasn't like a big deal, like he snuck it in or anything, but it was an unauthorized pen. And he used that pen to trip the circuit breaker without, the normal actuator. And they got off of the moon, and that was all great.
Using a felt tip pen.
Just using a felt, and he's got this felt tip pen to the day. I mean, it's a great story.
You would hang on to it, wouldn't you, if it'd been such an important part of your...
No, it's a great slice of history.
Yeah. So you've brought us not quite up to date, but so you've brought us to your involvement in trying to get back to the moon. Should we stop for a short break and then
sure.
Fill us in on what's been happening?
That's good.
Since.
Let's have some tea and biscuits.
Yes, let's. So welcome back. As you can see, we've got a nice cup of tea, which, we need to have when we're having a break. We also have some biscuits. Now, I usually ask the guests to nominate their favourite biscuit. In this instance, I've nominated on your behalf. I've taken
And I appreciate that.
an executive decision. So we have pickups, which avid viewers of the podcast will know that Joanna Feely of Trend Bible suggested them in a previous episode, and they've become a bit of a favourite. But also, you were in Scotland earlier this week, I believe, so we have some Tunnocks caramel wafers. Apparently, they make 7 million of those a week, which I really can't get my head around. We're not sponsored by either of those two brands, but if anyone from Tunnocks is watching and would like to send us a box, we would feature them on every episode. So we're open to bribes. So, but having said that, I'll let you choose.
I think I'm going to have a pickup.
Right. Well, I shall go for the caramel wafer.
Very good.
So we've what usually happens is that I now start asking you a question while we're trying to eat a biscuit, but I'm sure we can manage that without making too much noise on the microphone. So we've, you mentioned SpaceX as being one of the key players in the space world, and you've had some dealings with them, or you almost had some dealings with them. Is that right? Actually,
I did. Elon Musk offered me a job at one point.
Oh, really? Okay.
He did. This is particularly for someone who studies the business of space. I made one of the more catastrophically wrong decisions of my career. One of the issues, which wasn't with Elon, he had said you look qualified, and they were going to create a position for me. And so when we got to actual discussions, they said, well, of course, at Boeing, there was a bonus structure and all this kind of thing. And I said, well, what's your bonus structure here? And they said, well, we'll give you lots of stock. And this was in defense of myself. I want to say sort of the 2006, 2007 timeframe when SpaceX was really very young and was not, to be honest with you, very successful. And I said, well, I frankly think your stock is worthless right now. And of course, the company is now worth $255 billion. And had I stayed there, which I frankly think is really unlikely, I don't think it would have been a good fit for me, which is ultimately why
just keep telling yourself that.
Yeah. Right. So yes, I've had dealings with them in that way, and then also I was working for United Launch Alliance, which was really their Boeing first, which became United Launch Alliance when they merged Lockheed and Boeing's launch businesses. And so I was very much the target for SpaceX. And so early on, we tracked them very closely. And so, yeah, I've been very familiar with SpaceX. And as I said, I admire what they've done technically tremendously.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps who would have thought back in 2006 that they would have achieved everything that they have?
You did, of course, ask me a question just as I was eating a biscuit.
Yep. We need to do something about this.
You're a trained professional, truly. Interestingly, I was concerned about, in their early stages before they had actually flown the Falcon 9, which of course has become a very successful rocket, I was concerned about them starting to chip away at the edges of our business, but ultimately going after the very core of our business. And sadly, at least for ULA perhaps, I was right, and they did ultimately go for the core of our business.
So we've talked a lot about your kind of professional career and your work in space, but obviously, like most people, you have many other sort of passions and interests. And this is another intriguing photo that you sent. So this appears to be you riding a bicycle by a shipwreck. Is that correct?
It is.
So I mean, come on, you need to explain what's going on here.
So this is in the Cayman Islands, and the ship that you see is a ship that was carrying a load of marijuana.
Okay.
And was arrested and confiscated. And after confiscating all the marijuana, doing all the sort of things that law enforcement does. They didn't know what to do with the ship. So they sunk it right off of the coast, and it became kind of a dive site.
Okay.
One of the traditions in Cayman is that when one of the dive masters leaves, they take their bike and they throw it where the ship is. And they clean it up. Right. But we just happened to be diving shortly after this bike had been thrown in.
Oh, I see.
And it's not in terribly bad shape. But
actually, I've got a bike in the shed that looks significantly worse than that.
So, for me personally, the significance of this is I got to do several of the things that I really love doing. I mean, I love scuba diving, particularly with the photographer who actually took the picture, my wife, Maureen. I love taking pictures underwater, so sort of vicariously doing that. I love riding mountain bikes. And so what could possibly be better than
the perfect combination
that captures so much of what I love doing? And so I've just, this photo turned out, it's kind of magic. Technically, it's not a great picture, but it's a lot of me in that picture. So, yeah.
And you so since your time sending things into space and being involved in rockets and things, you've moved very much into the kind of educational area and getting younger people to be almost as passionate as you are about that. So how did that come about?
So there are really two elements to it. The first is the Aldrin Family Foundation, which is a foundation that what we do is we take the excitement of space and bring it into the classroom. And so, kids love two things. They love dinosaurs and they love space. And they get over dinosaurs. They don't get over space.
Right.
And so we take that excitement and use it to spark curiosity. But what we really focus on is actually turning it into curricula that we can bring into the classroom and teachers can teach to that curriculum. And so, for example, we have a relationship here with the University of Sunderland where we've worked with them and we provided the materials and some of our curricular materials. But they've gone and kind of tweaked this and done a wonderful job developing their own programs. And so we have programs in about 20 schools in Sunderland and Newcastle. And the programs all feature what are giant moon and Mars maps. And so what we're doing is taking kids and putting them on the moon or Mars, giving them great things to play with, and they're learning. And they're learning and they're meeting standards that they have to meet. And the results we've had here in Sunderland have been fantastic. So we're very excited about that and really want to kind of extend that. And so that's kind of what I call the space for education piece of it. And what I do at the university at Embry-Riddle is more education for space. And so I founded two graduate space studies programs there. They are online asynchronous, which I'll get into in just a minute. But the first program was a Master of Space Operations program. And that's, roughly speaking, equal parts of technology, program management, economics, policy, and law. And so the idea is for people that want to make a transition, whether it's a transition from aviation into space, other industries into space, from a space position where they may be working on something very focused in engineering, want to move up to a management or a leadership position, kind of educating them on the whole broader space ecosystem. Yeah. And this is where I get into, what I'm trying to teach them to do is ask the questions.
Right.
If you can't ask the questions, you're not going to get the right.
Because it must be unlike any other business ecosystem, I would imagine, or is it?
Yes and no. I mean, I'm kind of, the more I look at it, the more I back out and go, well, what we need to do, in fact, what I think the space community needs to do is realize that the foundation of space is not in space, it's on the ground. And so, for example, there's lots of discussion about manufacturing in space, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, but mostly what I see are space people that are sponsored by NASA to do some experiment on the space station to demonstrate that they can grow something some kind of crystals that can be used pharmacologically in semiconductors. They're literally looking at growing tissues, which is all wonderful and incredible stuff. But it's space people growing stuff for space people.
Right.
And so when we will be successful is when we have the chief technology officer at Merck or NVIDIA looking at the space station and whatever the future commercial space stations are as just another laboratory.
Right. Yeah.
And that hasn't happened yet by a long shot. So I really think that part of what I'm trying to do is teach people that space is merely a place for doing things, but ultimately you're in a terrestrial economy and you need to understand that economy and where you might have intersections with space. And I think that's kind of one of the really critical things that we need to do as an industry, as a technology sector, to actually grow up and mature and become part of the global economy. I touched briefly on the notion of online and asynchronous learning, which is hard. And generally, I think it tends to get underappreciated. But I'll tell you that the top 20% of my students are the best students I've ever had. And I've been teaching before as at Embry-Riddle. I was at Florida Tech, and I've taught as an adjunct for a long time. They're incredible. In part, they're incredible because they're a little bit more advanced in their career, know what they want to do. But also because the way you have to structure something to do it right when you're teaching online, because you have to give them something to do every week, because you don't meet with them in a classroom where you can kind of query them and you can find out if they're doing their readings or not. You have to give them something concrete, which is a lot of work for them. And it's also a lot of work for the instructors, for the teachers, because you've got to be working with them every week. You've got to respond to questions. And we typically give students a project for the term where they're analyzing a company or a particular market, and they have something to do every week. And so we're constantly grading what they're doing, but giving them suggestions for improving it. So while they may have a really bad idea at the beginning, most of them, and in particular the good students, get really, really great ideas by the time we're finished, because we're constantly working for them.
Right.
And so I see online education, and maybe in space in particular, as being it's starting, if you will, at the lower end of the market, but ultimately I think we will find this mode of education, because it's so much more accessible, and I think performs really well. It'll never replace Harvard or MIT or Stanford or things like that. However, I think for most of the people, they're going to find that over time, this is going to be a really, really effective way of getting more education out to the people.
Yeah, and it sounds like the opportunities that there are and the scope of what is possible. I think that it needs to be more accessible, isn't it? So that if we're going to need all of these people who are engaged in this, there need to be more ways to make that education available. I'll tell you that 3 years in now, we have 1,000 students, graduate students, in the first program. It's the fastest growing program that Embry-Riddle has ever created. And the second program, in the first 2 months, we've had 100 students come into the program. So it works getting out, but I think more importantly, what we know is that there are a lot of people out there, and I say people because a lot of them are adults, they're not kids. I mean, we do have a fair number that are just literally coming from undergraduate into graduate. There's a lot of interest in space out there, and I think, as an industry, we need to capture that interest and find a way to bring them in to sort of be better equipped than we're equipping students right now. You brought this up before, which is, how different is the industry of, my father's space program, I like to say, and my space program. And it's massively different, and different in the sense that we're pushing decision-making down to a lower level. And so you have to know more about the ecosystem that you live in. And as I mentioned briefly, it's not just about being an engineer
and executing a program plan. Now you've got to understand the business environment, the regulatory environment, and even the political environment, because it's no longer the government dictating everything. You've got to decide what's important.
Which is a big change.
It's great fun for me, though.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah. Now we've got time for a few more stories prompted by some of the other. So the other photographs that you sent to us. So this appears to be you at
It is.
At Stonehenge. Were you actually at Stonehenge?
I was.
Really?
I was. And I would love to say I took that picture, but there was actually a professional Stonehenge photographer who set it up and got a great picture of it. I'm actually doing a speech at Florida Tech. But we did go to Stonehenge. My father has been a great fan of kind of getting around the world.
Right.
And also...
And getting his ass to Mars, according to that T-shirt also.
You know, he has... there were people that helped him become, I think, very savvy to PR, which is something that I'm not. I have not inherited that. But I mean, this is a great picture. And for me, actually, giving this particular speech was a great opportunity, because I actually discussed my dad's ideas for going to Mars, and he has some he has a very, very interesting approach to going to Mars. He basically, without getting into a lot of the technical details, you put something into an orbit. It's literally an orbit around the sun, but in such a way that it passes by the Earth and then passes by Mars in a fairly short period of time, maybe 100, 200 days. And then, of course, it doesn't get back to take you back for a while. You might have, and so it actually works really well one way,
right?
Which sort of prompted my dad to say, well, if you go to Mars, you just go in there. Well, you're going to be there forever, like Elon, right? But you can actually configure it in such ways that you can bring it back. But the thing is, you only have to accelerate this large, if you will, habitat once, and you can just have a very small spacecraft, which is incredibly more efficient, because the major issue going to Mars is what we call galactic cosmic radiation. There's just radiation out in space beyond the Van Allen belts that is really dangerous, and we really don't have any easy ideas, except for lots of shielding, which is massive, right? It takes lots of mass to do that. Or there's some interesting ideas about electromagnetically shielding, but again, it's about large amounts of mass. But you only have to accelerate this once. Right. And so you could envision you have two of these things. It would be a super efficient way to get people to Mars.
Right. And we've heard Mr. Musk, who you mentioned earlier, talking about that being, perhaps not using that method, but being able to get to Mars within the next 4 or 5 years. I mean, is he crazy to say things like that? Or
I don't know if he's crazy, but he's optimistic, let's just say. And the thing is, Starship is a big, massive vehicle. But it's not really, interestingly, it's not configured to go to Mars. In fact, for anything beyond low Earth orbit, because of the way it's configured and because how big it is, it really performs very poorly. In fact, it literally can't take a satellite or a postage stamp into a geotransfer orbit, which of course is one of the more, you have to refuel it. And so you have to refuel it. It takes a 1.3 million kilograms of fuel.
Right.
That requires a lot of refueling. So to go to the moon, it takes 13 to 15 missions to refuel it. And that's Starship missions to refuel a Starship.
And that on its own is a massive undertaking,
I'd imagine. It is. So it's, in theory, it can get you to Mars orbit, but it actually doesn't, it's not configured to really land on the surface of Mars. So that's one thing, that the transportation system needs some refinement. And you can do that and probably take large amounts of mass to Mars orbit. I mean, you could land on Mars, but again, you'd have to have a much bigger Starship and probably use different rocket propellants, but I won't get too much into the technical weeds of it. But that's just one thing. And we actually understand space transportation. We don't understand things like galactic cosmic radiation. I mean, we understand it. We don't have easy solutions to it. There are a whole lot of other things about being on Mars that we don't really understand, and just in terms of life support. So when you go to Mars, you're there for 2 years, right?
It's not a quick visit.
You are 2 years away from a trip to the grocery store. So you've got to either bring all your stuff with you. And the other thing is, it can't break down. So if you look at the space station, if you look at the life support systems, they're not reliable. They're breaking down every month. They're constantly replacing things. And so there are just, if you look at the list of technologies and things that you have to get to Mars, and importantly, to get home from Mars, it's a huge list. And solving all of those problems in 2 to 6 years, it just seems pretty incredible. And I think even for SpaceX, it's going to take a lot of time to do that. And I don't really see a lot of work being done with making habitable systems for the surface of Mars and all the kind of stuff you'd have to have.
Sure. So we can take it with a small pinch of salt, but then who knows?
Well, I mean, back when I was at ULA, we questioned whether the Heavy would ever fly, and it did. And it was 4 years late or something like that. And so you kind of put that factor onto things, and maybe it could happen, but it's still going to be massively expensive. I mean, remember, NASA's paying SpaceX $4 billion just to do one landing on the moon right now. And so it doesn't come for free. Having said that, NASA right now is currently operating a program with some very, very expensive launch vehicles. And so it'll be interesting to see. For me, who's somebody who no longer has a dog in the fight, it'll be interesting to see what happens. And maybe we do pivot to going to Mars.
And who knows, in 5 years' time, I might be inviting you back to watch someone else's dad walking on Mars. We'll see.
If that is actually what happens, I would welcome the opportunity. I mean, it would be great if we progress that far. I'm just, as I said, my job right now is to teach people what makes sense.
Yeah. We have this one of speaking of speaking of rocket science.
Yeah. So actually, you should have cut off the bottom part of. So this is actually, in many ways, it's appropriate that my dad and I have different views on a lot of things. And so my dad has incredible ideas, and technically, they're all great. Most of them are great. There's a couple I don't know. But one of the problems with being the second person to walk on the moon, and my father claims the first person to land on the moon because he said his side of the spacecraft touched down first, is that lots of people want to talk with you.
Yeah.
And lots of people want to agree with you. And in many ways, my role with him has been to say, well, wait a minute, Dad, that, a great idea at the wrong time is still a bad idea. Right. And that's a particularly difficult pill for him to swallow. So this kind of embodies it and it is genuinely friendly conversations. I remember, although they tend to be monologues more than anything. There was one time we were sitting on a beach, and my dad and I were talking. Actually, he was talking, and I was trying to get a point across. I go, Dad, you're not listening to me. He said, yeah, I know. Sometimes that was kind of the way it went.
Is that when the look comes out?
So this is, my wife calls this the look that I give to some people. And this is actually at a conference in Beijing. I think it's 2018. So it wasn't long ago. And this is kind of the progression of our relationship that sometimes, and my dad is obviously talking to somebody oblivious to the fact that I'm staring at him, giving him the look. And so, that's it. I like this picture just because in many ways it kind of speaks, I think, to the evolution of our relationship.
And so you're here in the UK for another week or two. You're not a stranger to the UK. In fact, nope. we first met about 5 years ago when you spoke at a STEMFest that we held only, half a mile from here. And you were there inspiring thousands of kids, some of whom perhaps have since gone on to, exploring careers in the the space world. But you've also paid. This was in Durham Cathedral, I believe.
It was.
And that is an actual model of the moon that was
It
hovering
is.
above your head.
Yes.
While you gave a talk about space.
I did. It was incredible. Yeah, that was actually, that's the coolest speech I've ever given. It really was, to be in that cathedral with the moon up there and literally filled with people who wanted to listen to me talk about space. Yeah, very cool. That's actually the best picture I've seen. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah. So, I mean, a final question, I guess, is, would you, if you had the opportunity to go, this might be a daft question, actually, but if you had the opportunity to go into space in the next year or two, I'm assuming you would.
As long as somebody else is paying for it.
Right.
Right. I don't. $50 million to go into space, real space, right? Is a little steep, and even, Richard is now charging. He's jacked it up to $600,000 to go on a suborbital mission. No, I'd love to do it, but nobody's offered to pay for it yet.
Right. Okay. Well, maybe they will one day. And just finally, for the younger people out there watching, so you talked about how there are all of these careers opening up. Say, for someone who is at school and they're interested in getting into some kind of career in space, I mean, what sort of things should they be studying and thinking about and, becoming attuned to?
Well, so first of all, data's a little old, a year or so. I pulled some data off of I guess it's a website, but it's literally it's called Space Talent. They're trying to recruit people into the industry, and it's mostly kind of directed at the new commercial industry. I mean, you'll occasionally see Boeing things and stuff like that, but it's mostly companies like SpaceX, Blue, Spire, maybe even Clyde Space. Just there the other day. And so the largest group were engineers, of course, but not by a whole lot. If I'll take what I don't have the exact numbers on the tip of my tongue, but almost as large a group would be what I'd call business development and strategy. And so that's about understanding the market, understanding the customers, understanding the basic business that you're in. Typically, you need to have a foundation in business or engineering to get into those positions. But there are a lot of positions that aren't technically engineering positions. And so there's lots of opportunity out there for non-engineers. So that's the first point. The other point is just being a good engineer is not going to be enough in the future. I mean, maybe you start that way, but ultimately, particularly in commercial companies, I won't say new space or startups, but I mean, some of these companies are quite mature, but they're in a commercial marketplace where you're operating with fixed price contracts, where the government is expecting you to come up with some of the revenue through commercial sales. I think it's not going to be enough to be a great engineer. If you want to be a leader, if you just want to be in a cubicle, being an engineer, designing hatches or what have you, you can probably do that. But if you really aspire to have a great career, and there are lots of opportunities with startup companies, you need to understand the broader system. Ways of doing that, you can do things like the program that I'm teaching. There aren't many, but there are a few programs out there. International Space University does things that are kind of similar. In fact, I actually, in many ways, started some of my space educational career with International Space University. The other thing is just go get a job in the commercial sector, because it's going to be different. It's not going to be like being an engineer at Airbus or Lockheed. It's very different, and you will have to learn about the overall system, because your job one day. I'll give you an example. So when I was running Moon Express, I had a great woman who was my thermal engineer, and thermal engineers need to do a bunch of work up front with the original design, and then the design stuff happens, and there frankly wasn't a whole lot for her to do, but I needed her to do program management and some other, and she did. She jumped into that. And lots of people in the company had to do 3 different jobs, and everybody to some degree, had a job of business development and sales. And so if you get a job in a commercial company, you will have to learn about the overall environment.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a great thing if you have the risk tolerance, because be aware that there's better than a 50-50 chance with whatever company you go to work for. They may look really solid and have lots of investment. There's just a better than 50-50 chance they're going to go out of business. But that's okay if there are other companies out there, and there's kind of a growing ecosystem in the UK. And I think I'm very encouraged by a lot of what's going on in the UK.
Yeah, it's an exciting time, isn't it?
In some cases, just jump in.
Yeah.
But jump in with a new commercial company if you have the risk tolerance.
And as we've heard from yourself, who started out as a Sovietologist and ended up with a career in space, passion is the number one thing. Although I guess having a dad who walked on the moon probably helps just a little bit.
It distorted my career. But I'll be honest with you, it kind of worked both ways. In many cases, I think it may have worked against me because people had expectations that I got everything handed to me. It certainly gave me a fantastic education. But there were challenging things of growing up, as one of my friends said, as a second son of the second man on the moon.
Well, perhaps in 5 years' time, when you do come back and we watch the footage of someone landing on Mars, and you can tell us more about.
I'd be delighted to come
things.
back.
And it's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure, truly.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly did. So do join us again next time for another episode of Northern Spotlights. And don't forget to subscribe so you'll be the first to know when the next episode comes out. See you again soon.